Hey guys, so what I did for this video is survey the players in the Ritual Beast Dueling groups on Facebook and Discord just to get their thoughts in terms of key strengths and weaknesses and a lot more about this deck. So definitely a huge thanks to the 42 players that responded to the survey. Really appreciate it, and if you don't want to miss out on any future surveys, definitely go check me out on Twitter. And as always, definitely go check out my discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh! Supplies as well as singles. Stay tuned for those Infinite Forbidden pre-orders. I'm sure that will go crazy. Alright, well, let's just jump right into the results. And in terms of how difficult the deck is to pilot, the players noted an average of 9.1 out of 10, which is incredibly high. So if you recall, some of the more other decks that I've surveyed recently is Tenpai Dragons 4 out of 10, very, very low, known to be pretty straightforward to play. Melodious even as a combo deck was still around 6.3, and Yubel that I did very recently that you can check out as well. And again, this is before Infinite Forbidden, so before like the Fiendsmith stuff cards, but you know, it was roughly around 7 out of 10. So Ritual Beast has been known to be pretty hard to play optimally, and this clearly shows that as well. In terms of how consistent the deck is, they put it around 8 out of 10, which is actually pretty strong. Tenpai Dragons and Melodious, they were actually rated around 8 as well. Yubel was around a little over 7 because they did note some brickiness issues, because you do have to play a lot of high level monsters and some one-offs in Yubel deck, but at least for Ritual Beast, it seems to be pretty strong, especially, and consistent rather, especially with the new support they got in Battles of Legend. In terms of what tier the players would put Ritual Beast at, you know what, 1/5 actually put it at tier 1. I'm not quite convinced it's that high. Tier 2, you know, a good chunk of it. In terms of my recent meta tier list, which you can also check out based on regional and WCQ topping data, Ritual Beast was definitely categorized as tier 2. You do have to usually account for some of the, like, the quote-unquote initial hype that might play a factor in terms of, you know, they just got new support, they just had events that same weekend. Basically, you tend to see a lot more play with those kind of decks that get support. Not to knock on them, of course, because you know what, some decks, let's say you have something like Melodious, after the support and Legacy Destruction, they did well, but they continue to do well even well after that initial additional wave of support. So you might still see that with Ritual Beast as well. Post Infinite Forbidden, of course, you also have that Perlia new hand trap that kind of like the Maxi, which I can only assume is pretty strong against Ritual Beast, but who knows. In terms of the key strengths of the deck, there's several. The one that stands out is it's a deck that can play Shifter really well. The players were actually very confident that this is actually the best Shifter deck in the format right now. They also have access to other really strong floodgates like Colossus and or Protos, which are both quite strong, particularly for Protos, because, you know, realistically, as a lingering floodgate, you know, you're probably not going to be able to play that much. So that in itself is already a very big plus. Strong recursion each turn, and also like just incredible amount of consistency in grind game. Essentially, you also have you know, it's hard to know when to hand trap, because it's a deck that probably not many players are, even now after the support came out a couple weeks at this point, it's still kind of hard to catch up on all of these different decks, and especially Ritual Beast, where they're just essentially comboing for like 20 minutes. It is admittedly very hard to know when to stop them, right? And then you also have a good amount of non-engine space. This isn't really a unique strength at this point, right? But at the very least, you know, if you're going to play a deck in the current day of Yu-Gi-Oh!, you really do need to have at least like 12 non-engine space for the most part. In terms of the deck's ability to go first, the players rated an average of 9 out of 10. Very, very strong, of course. Tenpai Dragons is a comparison. Obviously not a good comparison at that, because they were going second deck, so they were rated really low. But Melodious, Yubel, they did have some pretty high scores along them as well. I mean, Yubel, for example, they were really confident in their end boards as well, because they actually have access to an Omni Negate, which nowadays decks don't really have. But with something like Ritual Beast, again, if we talk about something like Protos, that is incredibly strong and just like really very hard to stop. So I think that's why it's rated so high. In terms of its ability to go second, this was actually definitely noted as a weakness, which we'll get to a little bit later as well. Just being able to break boards with engine alone is just not really a thing for this deck, it seems like. And actually it's a common theme we've seen with something like Yubel as well, and something like Melodious. And obviously Tenpai is not a good comparison there, because they're known to go second. Now, in terms of the typical end board that players end with Ritual Beast, this was actually pretty hard to do, because it was all over the place in terms of responses. There's a variety of different combinations, and really sometimes it looked like it was more of an optimal board rather than a typical board. So what we'll do is, at least let's go through the most common cards that you should know that also came up in terms of at least Ritual Beast specific and some of the other generic stuff. So first, with the Ritual Beast specific stuff, you have the link for that is a quick effect banish, essentially. The Nachi, the fusion one, this also provides targeting protection for the Ritual Beast stuff. And then the Steeds, the trap, this is something you should be aware of, because it does provide non-targeting pop. It looks like for the most part they'll be able to pop like 2 cards. Technically, they noted they can pop up to 6 cards, but that probably doesn't really happen that often. And then, of course, you have some more generic stuff, which you're going to be used to with a lot of decks with IP going into something like SP, for example, for that banish. And then, as mentioned, you have something like Protoss and or Colossus. In terms of Protoss, being able to call, I think it's usually like at least like Fire or Dark, and being able to prevent that. And then you also have Colossus, which essentially prevents your opponent from adding any cards. They can draw though, but for the most part, it can still be pretty strong. And then some other Ritual Beast cards that you should be aware of is something like Spiritual Beast Tamer Lara, which in the grave it can provide kind of a card destruction protection. It's kind of like Balinks basically if you think about it. They also have this Lion guy that's an Omni Negate, kind of similar to like I want to say Herald of Perfection, where instead you're just sort of banishing your Ritual Beast from your hand, but it is multiple times you can do it. It's not once per turn, so it's actually can be quite strong. And then you should of course be aware of something like Appaloosa. Any deck I think that makes us, or rather IP. You should probably assume they can also go into Appaloosa. And then you have something like, let's say, Baguska, which is another kind of like floodgate-ish card that they can make. Now, in terms of the hand traps that impact this deck the most, so in other words, some of the cards that are going to be good to side against something like Ritual Beast. So you had Nibiru pretty high up there, and also Droll. Some of the notes that they mentioned is you can't play through both Nibiru and Droll. Like one line you choose will be susceptible to the other, but realistically you can say that about pretty much every deck. So Nibiru, or rather, let's go with Droll first. They did mention though, at least if your first search is like Kanahawk, then at least you can still set up something like the Link 4, the Nochi, and maybe even IP. I think they lose access to the Steeds, the Trap. That, at least based on the survey comments. Nibiru plus Imperm, they were saying is just game, but again, that's something you can say about any deck really. And I think with Lancia, they were saying it's actually the one hand trap they just cannot play around, and it is a complete entire turn skip. But luckily for them, you're not going to see Lancia in this current format at all. It last played, honestly, maybe when Kashyyyr first came into meta, there was some little bit of side deck play for Lancia, from what I recall. But aside from that, even, it really has not seen much play even in the last 2 years alone. You have something like the remaining hand traps that didn't seem to be as impactful. They did mention this deck can still pretty much eat through a lot of different hand traps as well. Shifter kind of came up, someone mentioned about in the mirror. It can be a little annoying in terms of being able to go into Nochi, which I believe you can like banish Ritual Beast from the graveyard to go into it as well. But other than that, it looks like it didn't really come up. And then in terms of board breakers that are impactful against this deck, so again, we're going to have to talk about Protoss, because even if you clear your opponent's board, you probably can't play if they did, resolve Protoss. So that's something to consider as you interpret these results though, because evenly match, because of that Lara I mentioned about card destruction protection, and which is also why Raigeki Dark Hole is probably not that great. Evenly match at least gets through that. They do have a lot of recursion, it seems like, after, so it is something to keep in mind. They can come back. And Dark Ruler, they do have a lot of monster-based interruptions, except for, of course, you still have to be aware of the Steed's trap. But speaking of that trap, that's where something like Sphere Mode, Lava Golem, even maybe Super Poly might come up, where as long as you clear those monsters, because they do need to control a Ritual Beast to be able to activate that trap, so something like Sphere Mode and Lava Golem can be good, although for the decks that can play these cards, it's very, minimal. Super Poly, it looks like you can potentially play into it, let's say like something like IP and Colossus or Protoss, but again, if you're hit by Protoss, then you're probably not playing much anyways. You also have the Link 4, that's a Wind, which I guess maybe if they also have Appaloosa or something. I'm not sure if they can even have both links, but anyways, I guess those are wins. Droplet was interesting because they actually noted how you have to be careful on the number of cards you send for cost for Droplet, because with the trap, the Steeds, they can just sort of pop their own Ritual Beast stuff and kind of modify the number of monsters on board. Because remember with Droplets, let's say if you send 4 cards as cost and your opponent, while they had 4 at the time you activate it, let's say they make a way to alter their board so they only have like 3 monsters. In that case, Droplet is actually not going to negate anything. So it has to be able to, your opponent has to have minimum number of the cards that you send as cost as well. So that's where that can potentially come up. And some of the other Kaijus, I guess, is kind of like the similar lines of Sphere Mode, but not nearly as good. Lastly, in terms of the floodgates that are impactful against Ritual Beast, so Dimension Barrier was pretty high up there, but they were actually noting in the comments too about, Dimension Barrier and also like similar Grave of the Ancient Organism. Ritual Beast, they do still have some kind of like link plays. For example, they can make SP, and if you can, at the very least, you can get rid of something like Grave of the Ancient Organism, which is nice, unlike me, like a branded player, where we just completely lose to this deck. Rivalry does affect them too. They do have a lot of different types, but ironically enough, there can be only one can also affect them, because their links are all psychics. and I think they have other psychics too. But also deck lockdown, that's kind of common. Necro Valley, they didn't really mention this in the comments. I guess again, something like Nochi, I guess if you have to banish from grave to summon it, that's where maybe it comes up. Synchro Zone, Skill Drain is interesting because I know they can play Skill Drain themselves, but obviously if, let's say, Ritual Beasts are trying to go second against the deck and they have their whatever usual end board and they're just trying to start their plays and they hit with Skill Drain, I mean, for most other decks, that's going to be quite impactful. They also noted something about Imperial Iron Wall being complete FTK as well. I never actually considered putting that in the survey. I guess I sort of overlooked it because I mean, technically, yes, it can be a floodgate against a very small number of decks. Realistically, I would say the only time Imperial Iron Wall, at least in the recent years, saw any form of play competitively and very small number was just more so to prevent evenly match for decks that just completely lose to that card and they don't have their own Omni Negate. But maybe something I should consider putting into the options. And finally, in terms of the weaknesses of Ritual Beast, there's several here. One is just not being good into an established board. We already talked about its weakness going second. They mentioned they really have to only rely on non-engine, and one of the reasons why it's not going into an established board because it is normal summon reliant, and decks like that, it is kind of hard, especially when your opponent plays a deck that has a lot of interruption that involve destruction or like just removing bodies, which can be really hard. Difficult to pilot, we saw that was 9 out of 10. It's honestly probably one of the highest, if not the highest, in terms of difficulty among all the decks that I've surveyed in the last year of all the different meta relevant decks. Of course, there are different players responding to these surveys, and difficulty, of course, is subjective, but I do think there's still a common theme there that it is pretty hard to pilot. Extra deck being very tight. They mentioned how, I believe most of them do play Prosperity, and if they do, they can only banish 3 at a time, and they were noting that if you see them banishing 6 to start their turn, then clearly that they have bricked, because really their deck is very tight in terms of resources and just like the anti-banish techs. For example, Lancea and Imperial Iron Wall, you're honestly seeing 0 play of that. You're not going to have to worry about that. The only one that might potentially come up in a very minor situation is something like Chaos Hunter, and I only bring that up because with Sprite getting new support, sort of quote-unquote support with like the 2 cards that they're going to put in their deck for the Ice Barrier stuff, they can go into Toad, and one of the things Sprite's known for is the Mannequin Cap play post side, and Chaos Hunter is one of those Mannequin Cap targets, so that's maybe the only time that could come up, but otherwise I don't think anyone's really playing any kind of anti-banish text, at least for the time being. Anyways, guys, that was it for the Ritual Beast survey breakdown. Again, thanks to those who respond to the survey. Really appreciate it. Definitely go check me out on Twitter to not miss out on any kind of future surveys as well. Anyways, a huge thanks to all of you for watching. Big thanks to my patrons and sponsors for the continued support, and well, take care, guys.